Okay, it looks like I am streaming. I'm on. We're ready to roll. And, oops, just trying to get my monitor on. And you get to watch the dramatic shot of me walking towards the camera. That was pretty cool, coming at you. Okay, so, a couple things. First off, I know a lot of you are taking the PSAT, and I envy you. But I did say I was going to do a little bit of a class today, so this will be up. Yes, this will be due. The notes will be due on the Monday when you get back. And so turn them in any time after this. The assignment should drop at any time. There is a little quiz, 6-question quiz on the second part of chapter 6. It should have dropped already. And just take it over the next few days. It should take you no time at all. I expect everyone to do well. Just for a little reminder, next week we are going to get ready to write an essay. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it before or after the test. I do want to do one more time a short IDs. I really emphasize writing in here. That is why, for those of you who did not do as well on your last exam as you thought you should, or wanted to, or whatever it might be, that's why I wanted you to write, even though some of you had trouble with the multiple choice, and that's the way it goes. Let me backtrack. And so these notes will be due. We will have 2 days off. Don't forget, the check teams. There are a couple, check today's message. There are 2 assignments up there. One is a short reading from the beginning of the the Jeffersonian era. And I'm going to push that back a day. So check teams, I'm going to move it back to Tuesday or Wednesday. But the big reading, chapter 12, that we'll have a quiz. So this time next Wednesday, I will have that quiz out for you. And we might do it online. I haven't decided yet. I am looking at the screen I'm showing you with all the S's that look like F's, and it's very hard to read. Okay, so we talked about Madison's number 10, talked about the Federalist or Anti-Federalist. And remember the big issue about the Federalists, they wanted that stronger government and the unity, government of a better sort. The Anti-Federalist, they were a little more all over the place. Bill of Rights, which was Jefferson's big deal. Let me see if this is working. And remember the big issue. Yep. And they feared the central government that would lead to a loss of liberty, that they wanted to have state control for militias, especially southern states, because of fear of slave rebellion. And so those are the big issues coming out of this. And something underlying this whole thing was this fear of a standing army. They both actually claimed they feared it. Hamilton wanted a standing army. Standing army, collect debts. But Madison's Federalist number 10 in New York, we talked about how factions, this we did in class, factions were political parties. The biggest thing that at least Madison thought was property, and that fits in with his self-interest. If the biggest issue is property, so there'll be 2 political parties based upon property, the one with property will be significantly smaller. And democracy is majority rule. And if you did not write that down from yesterday, please make sure you write that down. Where's my mouse? I'm going to emphasize that again. And the anti-democratic movement, it's going to be called the Whigs in the 1830s. They would call democracy or majority rule king numbers. The idea being, if you have more numbers, you get your you get your program passed. You become almost like a king if you get the numbers. So a couple things then. What makes a republic better? And so Madison puts out a few things. And so let's make sure this works. Sorry, I was just trying to get it up on the screen. So the first part about this is, if you can read that top line, from the view of this subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy by by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer government, they cannot stop the mischiefs of faction. I love that. What that means is, to Madison, democracy equals factions, which equals political parties. And therefore, the republic, as he sees in the next thing, the cure for which we are seeking. Republic, no faction. So that's the number one advantage, as he saw, for having no factions. I'm sorry, for having no democracy. We won't have these factions. And remember, the biggest cause of faction? The biggest cause of faction? Property. So the first one is, it says it in the bottom one, talking about the greater number of citizens, the greater sphere of the country of the latter may be extended. One big advantage of a republic, it can expand over a larger amount of territory. I'm looking outside, I'm just seeing all these leaves blowing by. The wind has really picked up here. I imagine everywhere. And now I forgot what I was saying. That a big country like the United States, it would be impossible to try to administer from what is going to be Mississippi or Louisiana way up in Philadelphia, which was the ad hoc capital of that time, especially before modern transportation. It would have been impossible. Think how difficult it would be now if you had a democracy and we'd sit there in Helena, Montana, trying to govern what goes on in Philadelphia right now. Should the corner of Main and Maple Street in Peoria, Illinois have a stoplight? Those are the kind of questions we'd have to be asking. Instead, we send representatives and they make those decisions. But let's get to the big reasons, which are next. And let me get the pointer here. Pointer, option, pointer. Sorry. Here's the biggie. If you read the top where the pointer is, by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will least sacrifice it. Okay, what it means by temporary or partial considerations, what that means is that they will be less likely to be swayed by others' opinions. They will only do what's best. So what Madison is saying, we will not have the mob talk. They will pick the best people, who he says right here, the smartest and the most patriotic, who only care about others. And as we all know, that's the only kind of people that are elected. Did Madison really honestly believe that only the best, the smartest, the most patriotic, and the most honest people will be elected? No, of course not. He knew it was going to be much more complex than that. Remember, he's trying to sell the Constitution to the State Assembly in New York, who are elite like him. And what Madison is saying, people like you are the elite. Aren't you great? Don't we want people like you? And you can imagine them sitting there going, you're right, I am great. And so that's part of it. So, just one sec. No, I'm staying. And then, under such regulation, okay, that's a regulation in the context of 1787 meant rules, controls. So what this meant is not a hodgepodge of government, very organized. So the opposite of disorganized. I want to make that clear because we'll come back to that word in a second. And we'll come back to the word especially when we talk about the Second Amendment. But it may well that the public voice pronounced by the representative of the people will be more consonant to the public good than it pronounced by the people themselves. Meaning, the representatives know more than what the people know. The people themselves are an unruly mob. They don't know what's good for them. We know what's good for them. So this is very much a patriarchy. So, the most patriotic who know what's best for you. You're not smart, I know what's best. Like a parent. And lastly, the other point, the greater number of citizens, more difficult for factions. So we already have mentioned that once before. But then this is the biggie. And you must get this down. Must get this down. Extend the sphere, which is the area under the control of the republic. And you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. So saying that, you read it, we think we got it. You look at that, and it's, okay, awkward language, it is 1787. But what he's saying is, if we have a republic, it will protect the rights of other citizens, meaning the minority of citizens from the majority. It will protect the minority from the majority. So the majority, the tyranny of the majority, as they would soon say, would not crush the rights of the minority. Now, you could argue this is a good thing, but it also depends on what the minority is. Madison wasn't thinking the minority of people who are maybe of different race, nationality, religious group. No, what he's thinking is the minority here is property owners or maybe even slave owners, to protect the majority or the minority from the tyranny of the majority. So protect the minority. So it's complex when people say this government cares about minority rights and tyranny. Well, it depends on who the minority is. And I want to be very clear about it. Madison is thinking all of us elite alike are the minority. We got to protect ourselves from the unruly mob. But as it turns out, the people in the elite might have different points of view. That will shock him. So there's Madison. So republic, no factions, no parties. The most patriotic, alike-minded elite. That's what he's thinking. Why did he want this? Well, let's go through the reasons really quick. As we mentioned, they feared the mob. Ooh, it was all supposed to pop up in order, whatever. They feared the mob. They feared majority rule. They feared majority rule. King numbers. Property. And this debtors versus creditors. They were really worried about the interest. Okay, I just got caught watching the cat across the street playing in their window. It's my fault. Focus. And debtors versus creditors. We've talked about this before. Who will protect the interests of the debtors over the creditors? Ironically, when this came down and Madison and Hamilton are looking at this and they're going, yeah, we got to protect debtors against creditors or creditors versus debtors. They have certain interests. Madison is a farmer. He's a big plantation owner. He sees himself as this narrow group of huge debtors. Hamilton is thinking in terms of creditors. Wow, will this blow up? So one of the things we have to get out of this, it's almost impossible to have a democracy without political parties. In fact, it's impossible. You cannot have a democracy without political parties because political parties are the only way that a large group of people can get their voices heard. A bunch of individuals have almost no power. And if you don't believe me, go to Capitol Hill right now and demand justice and you will be ignored. But if you can get millions of people behind you, then you have power. And the only way people have power is through democracy. So those who don't want democracy, and according to Madison, those who most fear their property or come to the creditors and they fear the majority rule, they want to weaken political parties. They want the political parties to be relatively obscure, not really clear what they stand for, not really fighting. And it might seem like the political parties are strong today because it seems so polarized. The political parties in the United States are shockingly weak. Half the well, not quite half, but almost half, many times in polls, of people in the United States consider themselves to be independent. There's only two choices in a two-party state. That's what we got, winner take all. And if half the people are independent, those are weak parties. So that's what Hamilton wanted, or that's what Madison wanted. And it worked. New York did ratify it. And you see this right here. Remember I showed you the pillars from yesterday? There's the pillar of New York. These are the ratification dates. Rhode Island would ratify after the Constitution became law. These became the states of the new union. That is the government of the land. 1789, now they had to scramble and put in a new government. And thus, even though we're talking about the founding of the Republic, we need a new heading. You get to see, oh, I got to save this. So, it's going to be called the Federalist Era. And I was originally going to talk about the Bill of Rights right now. Those are birds I took a picture of in Costa Rica. Yep, I think they're great. But for some reason I have two headings to this, but I wanted two headings. Okay, the Federalist Era. And we're talking about 1789 to 1801. By the way, this is a very stylized picture of Washington coming into Philadelphia. He didn't like to shake people's hands. There's John Adams, the vice president. And these are the key figures of the Federalist Era. And let me get my pointer again. Oh, I got distracted. The Bill of Rights, I'm not going to talk about the Bill of Rights right now. I need a drink. Do that on class on Monday. So I'm going to skip ahead, even though the first big bit of business was the Bill of Rights that Madison would write for Thomas Jefferson. So speaking of that, here's Washington, a little pixelated. Picture I expanded too much. Didn't look that bad on the computer. But Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Adams. The Federalist Era. And so, like I said, we're going to get through the Bill of Rights. Okay. So let's get to Washington's precedents first. Washington's precedents. And I put these up pretty quick. Washington, in many ways, would establish the presidency. Here's a picture of his first cabinet from an old textbook. I think that picture is kind of funny. But from his first cabinet. But first off, what he did is he set the stage that the president will be called Mr. President. Not Your Highness or Your Excellency. They are not nobility. And Washington, although he wanted to be a country gentleman, did not believe in nobility. Yes, he got his start because his father was fairly rich and so inherited it. There's complexities here. Next, Washington would only serve 2 terms. He was exhausted. Heck, he was exhausted before he started his first term. But he only served 2. Next, the court system would be created. And the base court system that Congress would create in 1789 with that Judiciary Act is still the base court system of today. It has been expanded a number of times over the years, and they did create the Supreme Court, and they've gone back and forth between 8 to 11, eventually 9, because that's how many circuit courts there were for the Supreme Court. That's why there are 9 members of the Supreme Court. And we've been at 9 for 170 years, and every once in a while there's talk about expanding that. It really depends on who's in power. And who the Supreme Court helps. Another story for down the road. The Constitution said that the president will have a cabinet of advisors, essentially, to handle the various jobs of the executive. And so Washington set the precedent of appointing a cabinet based loosely on the British parliamentary cabinet, but they would be confirmed by the Senate. As I mentioned before, one of the checks. And the Constitution says advise and consent. Advise and consent meant an up and down vote in the Senate. And lastly, Washington gave a farewell address. At this farewell address, he laid out a little bit about his administration, but his fears for the future. And this would lead to, a lot of alliteration there. This would lead to every president making a farewell address. Some have been more dramatic. The 2 most dramatic farewell addresses were Washington's and Dwight Eisenhower's, which we'll get to a little bit later, from 1961. So, let's look at the cabinet. The cabinet had 4 members. What is it now? 16, and technically there's a couple more. Cabinet's much bigger. But don't forget, the executive branch in the world has changed. With the development of capitalism and the expansion of the country, there are significantly more roles for the federal government. But the State Department would be Thomas Jefferson. There's him right there. And this, by the way, this was done 50 years after. These became popular in the 1840s, modern printing. Thomas Jefferson, and originally they handled everything from seating the ceding district and appellate judges to foreign affairs. Now it is only foreign affairs. The Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. And there's Edmund Randolph of Virginia. He was the guy who proposed Madison's actual plan, the Virginia plan at the Constitutional Convention. Originally, this was more of a lawyer. Now this is the law enforcement agent for the United States, and it is supposed to be it has to be separate from the president, because the Attorney General might have to look into illegal activities of the executive branch itself. There has been conflict of interest. Probably the most famous example of potential conflict of interest is when John Kennedy in 1961 picked his brother to be the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. And we will have to wait till context. So the Democratic President Kennedy then, the current President Trump, there's been accusations that the Attorney General William Barr is like that. Now, that one we have to wait for context. The Secretary of War, which no longer exists, it's been rolled into the future Navy Department, into the Department of Defense, and that's Henry Knox right there. The guy commanded Washington's cannon. He brought the cannon from Ticonderoga to Boston during 1775, and then Alexander Hamilton right here. Washington's aide, brilliant man, monarchist for the most part, or dictator. He would have great influence over the creation of the first government and many of the good and bad elements of it. His vision of the country would very much compete with Thomas Jefferson's. So this is the cabinet. And there would be more down the road. Washington would be bitterly surprised. I mean, it make him very upset how his Secretary of State and his Secretary of the Treasury would not only fight, but become the leaders of the first two political parties, which nobody expected. Remember, republics weren't supposed to have parties. So let's get to Hamilton's vision. Hamilton's vision for the future. Just a second. I'm sorry, I gotta check something. I know. Oh, nothing big. Seems to be working okay. So, Hamilton's vision. Hamilton's vision was, as he sought a future of the United States that would be based upon manufacturing. And he laid it out in two very important documents: the Report on Credit and the Report on Manufacturers. Now, the Industrial Revolution was just beginning in Britain, and this would change, literally change everything. Madison only knows about it from what he has read. He has no real idea what the impact of this would be, and those around him, especially men like Jefferson, not only don't know much about it, they're terrified of it. And this would lead to the factions. Hamilton's vision, first political parties, because they would be opposed to his faction. Now, this is a very funny little cartoon, and not going to talk about it, I just thought it was funny. This is from an old textbook from the 1960s. And it's not necessarily wrong, it's just kind of funny. So, it's a three-part, well, actually four-part. It's complex. Let's go with four. Three parts of his vision that would directly lead to the first political parties. Now, normally I would do this on the board and be drawing arrows and lines. Well, obviously I can't do that. And so I might be a little off because I typed this up in the summer. I typed this up in the summer, and give me one sec. Having a couple, my computer froze. Sorry, just give me a sec. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, it's not working. Here we go. Now it's up. Okay, so sorry about that. Still not working. Come on. All right. So Hamilton's plan was something that he and Madison originally agreed on. This is one of their big issues when they came to the Constitutional Convention. They wanted the power to tax to pay back their bonds. So what the bill, it's called the Assumption of Debts Bill. Sometimes you see it called the Assumption Bill. They would pay off all old colonial, all state, all continental debts, but also the Articles of Confederation debt. And the biggie was at 100% of the value. I can't emphasize enough what a big deal that was. 100% of the value. Normally, in a situation like this, if somebody owes money to somebody else, they'll make a deal. They'll call it a haircut or something like that. They'll cut off the top of the debt. Oh, I should add. Did my computer froze? I've gotten really blurry. Have I been blurry this whole time? I've been blurry this whole time. And I agree that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it might be too much streaming going on. Well, I'm blurry. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so they called a haircut, cut a little bit off the top, pay a little bit lower. But what Hamilton wanted was he wanted to make sure that whoever had those bonds would not only get the full value of what the original loan was, but interest. And this was going to be a big benefit to the various bondholders because originally many of the first bondholders were veterans, some officers, some poor, and a lot of officers were given this. In fact, this was kind of Hamilton's plan. He wanted the poor officers to sell those off. And that's what happened. A lot of these bonds were sold. They sold the bonds to speculators. So what happened was this. Imagine you had a bond. It says from the Continental Congress. So that's a 1780. And it says, we will owe you $100. I'm just throwing a number out here. $100 in 1800. And you're sitting there in 1887. And you're watching, Shays' Rebellion, and there's no currency. And you're thinking, I have something that's completely worthless, and I'm broke. So what they did is they sold it to speculators. But speculators are going, sure, I'll buy the bond. I'm going to gamble that the U.S. government will be around and be stronger down the road. But I'm not going to give you full value. I'll give you 10% of the value, like $10, or more commonly, 1% of the value. And you might think, why would people do that? If you're desperate, you do it. And you think, what am I going to do with this piece of paper? Here you go, sucker. By the way, this might shock you. How many of the members of the Constitutional Convention were bondholders? 90%. They had those bonds and they wanted their money. Guess what? At 100% value. Self-interest always ties in, and it's something that's very hard to overcome in situations of government. I'm more clear now, I think. Okay, so who were the speculators? Well, speculators had to have extra money. You're not going to go out and speculate on a lot of bonds if that means tomorrow you don't have enough money to eat. So, this is the merchant class. These are the merchant class who are buying these bonds because they had extra money, or at least they thought they did. And so what Hamilton's plan was, if you pay at 100% value, this will funnel money to the wealthy. In fact, his idea was, we'll funnel money from poor farmers to wealthy merchants. So farmers had this bond that at one time was worth $100. So I have $100 right here. It's worth $100. They sold it for virtually nothing. So they had wealth that is now sucked to the merchants, who not only have the wealth, they know that the federal government's going to pay it off. So this is worth its value. That gave them an immense amount of wealth. That tells everybody that these bonds are going to be protected and they're going to be repaid. So it's a way to suck money from farmers to merchants, but he's not done yet. Where's the money, the gold, going to come from? Well, first off, what he wanted was this. If we are going to make sure and tell everybody we pay back our debts, that means we get good credit. That means you can trust them. By the way, that's a newspaper article announcing the assumption bill. We give good credit. We pledge to pay it back. And this is important because if you don't have good credit, that means that you have to, if you're a debtor, accept a higher interest rate, pay more back. And trust me, you probably would know what that is. If I go and try to buy a brand new car, and you go and try to buy a brand new car, and I mean you as a 16 or 17-year-old in Helena, Montana, I will get lower interest. I'll probably get significantly lower interest rates than you if we both have to borrow money. Because I am older, I've had a job for longer, I have good credit, whatever it might be, I will get better just by who I am. And so what Hamilton is trying to do is, he's trying to say this brand new country, which a lot of people think might be a credit risk, no, we're not. Not only do we pledge to pay back our future debts, we're going to pay back every penny of our old debt. Now you could argue this is good policy. Now one thing about it though, why did he want this? He didn't want this to pay back the debt. He wanted to borrow more money. Hamilton wanted more debt. Hamilton wanted to issue bonds like ticker tape. Just run it through as fast as he can. Just shove out bonds. He wanted more debt. He wanted the U.S. government to have lots of debt. He wanted as many people in the United States, wealthy merchants, to be buying up these bonds. Why would they buy them, you might ask? Because we pay back our debts. It's a safe investment. The safest investment in the world today are still U.S. government treasury bills, which are bonds. Okay, maybe Japanese bonds are really valuable too. German bonds are really valuable. American bonds are the most valuable. No matter what. That's why our currency is valuable. We pay back our debts. Okay, so that has good consequence, but he had a goal behind this. So we borrow money, and then the federal government will invest in this new thing called manufacturing. Now, there have been old manufacturing, but something with machines. He had no idea the implications of this. This was the future we're talking about. But in roads, we need roads to connect this huge country together. And also, I didn't put down but things like canals and harbors. I think you get the point. And who buys these bonds? AKA, who are the creditors? This is the amazing thing. So what Hamilton wanted to do is pay back the old bonds to the merchant class. So they turn around and the merchant class buys these bonds back. The merchant class turns around and buys the bonds back. And why did they do that? Because they want their money, or they'll do it with the expectation is they'll get their money back. And Hamilton knows he can use that. He can use that to his advantage. If you get this entire class, the merchant class, the moneyed elite, who all are sitting there buying bonds, and then they buy these bonds, and they're sitting there with, I got all these pieces of paper saying the federal government owes me money. Well, they know, the merchant class knows, They won't get their money back unless the federal government survives. And that's huge. They won't get their money back unless the federal government survives. So what will that do? That will bind the merchant class to the country. He will buy their loyalty. So Hamilton is basically saying, if I said Madison once, I always meant Hamilton. This is always Hamilton. Hamilton is basically saying the merchant class are loyal to only one thing: money. So we make sure that their money is always tied to the U.S. government. How? Through debt. They have to support the government to get their money back. And that means they have to support the taxation of the government and the expansion of the government. And to Hamilton's point of view, Hamilton's program. So this is all Hamilton. Hamilton. So I think I might have said Madison. I did not mean to. So bind the merchant class. And you can imagine Jefferson is going, what? You got to be kidding. Your government policy is not going to support loyal Americans, but mercenaries? Where does the money come from? Well, the money's going to come from a tax on whiskey. Meaning, I did not want that. Time out. Act like that didn't happen. It was supposed to. There we go. An excise tax on small whiskey producers. So an excise tax, I mentioned these taxes before, it just, it adds to the cost of the whiskey. So if there's a 10% tax on whiskey and you sell $100 worth of whiskey, you must pay a $10 tax. And the way this is, and these taxes are done all the time, it operates a little bit like a sales tax because they pass it on to the people they sell to. And I want to be clear about it. This excise tax was geared towards small producers. The bigger the production, the smaller the tax. The bigger the production, the smaller the tax. So this is meant to hit small farmers. And then the revenue would pay back the bonds. And so here you get pay back the bonds, assume the debt, levying an excise tax on whiskey. I just thought that's funny. I like the guy with the coonskin hat going, with his arms on his side. And that's, and it's still. Whiskey, because they were so short of money. Remember we talked about all the financial problems. Heck, colonies had no money. The Continental Congress had no money. And the Articles of Confederation was a financial disaster. So whiskey was like money. They would use whiskey to buy and sell goods. And there was also their most valuable commodity. It's very difficult to ship bushels of wheat overland when there's no roads. Barrel of whiskey, relatively easy. And so this was not just an important product. This was the lifeblood of rural farmers, especially in the West, like Western Pennsylvania, New York, all along, especially in the Northeast. It's a little more complex in the South. But his plan was specifically to drive small producers into bankruptcy. He wanted to crush the small producers. So the small producers cannot survive, cannot pay back their debts. They go to debtor's court, they lose their land, and who's left? The big producers, thus creating monopolies. He wanted monopolies, therefore, and that's why they were taxless. Monopolies would be favored, drive out the small consumers. When they go broke, the big ones can scoop up those at low prices and create monopolies. He was a monopolist. He liked monopolies. Monopolies funnel money from the vast majority of people to the elite. That's his goal. He wants the elite to have money. We're going to go into more detail why in a second. What will happen to all these small farmers that are kicked off their land? Well, they have no choice. Starve. So they will go to the city and be the cheap labor in the new factories. They will go to the cities and become what Jefferson will call wage slaves. And they will be so desperate, they'll take whatever wage they get to work monotonous, incredibly dangerous jobs in these new factories that it's Hamilton's vision. Who will build these factories? Those wealthy merchants who he's supporting with the Assumption Bill and these new monopolists. That is his plan. And so he's to basically destroy small farmers and make them subservient workers, serfs. Remember I told you he wanted a dictatorship and feared the mob? He held regular people with contempt. Now you might wonder, wait a second, Hamilton was an orphan? He is the definition of somebody who came from the most humble means, a commoner, and rose to the top. Well, to Hamilton's point of view, I did it because I'm smart. Why don't you do it? And if you don't do it, that means you're lazy and inferior. We'll talk about this. So, Hamilton's goal. He wanted the country to be ruled by this very narrow financial elite. The financial elite of something new, they'll create the first banking system, and that's the First National Bank. This financial elite will be the merchants who will buy and sell and control things through debt, and these new monopolists. And the people are only laborers, workers, to work and toil in the factories. But will workers toil in the factories? Will workers say, no, we don't want to pay the tax? What do you do then? He wanted a strong military in case of rebellion. Part of his goal, as he saw it, was many of these merchants and financial elite were the officers in the old Continental Army. And something big just blew by. Were officers in the old Continental Army, and he would benefit them. So he wanted this tie-in between the financial elite and the military that would control the rebellions and make them pay the taxes. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about the police? This is before police. The army was there as a way to force acquiescence. I should add, to Madison and Jefferson, this was terrifying. So, with that, Madison and Jefferson furious. I would argue this is a good place to stop. And so we're going to stop right there. No, we're not. We're going to finish this real quick. Let me see. Let's get through this last part really quick. So I had the technical issues, remember? I'm sorry. I want to get through this. So they're furious. And why were they furious? As they saw, this is going to be, and it was. This was the plan. They saw it. Hamilton did not lie. We're going to suck money from poor farmers and take it to merchants. And the power of the country will go from rural to urban. Well, Jefferson and Madison were farmers. This is a direct attack on them, taking their money and giving it to somebody else. Next, as he saw, we're going to give the money to merchants, as I told you before. Jefferson, in fact, will call them. They're nothing but mercenaries. Soldiers who will fight for whatever country gives them the most money. They have no loyalty. And Jefferson could not believe it. You're saying that people who are disloyal to the country are more important to the country than loyal Americans. I got to be clear about this. Hamilton would have said yes. What their vision of a patriot or a nationalist was is complex, as it is today. So, they're farmers and plantation owners. Jefferson and Madison could see what would happen to plantation owners too. This would mean more debt and more taxes on farmers. And they would all come, and they would use this term a lot, slaves to finance. The debtors would become slaves to the creditors. Because, and you will find this out, once you sign that papers to, let's say, buy a house or buy a car, you're stuck. You got to make that payment every month. And if you don't, you know there will be harsh penalties. In the United States of America, creditors have the power. And that's what they were fearful, because farmers are always in debt. Now remember what I told you, everyone's in debt, but farmers are really hit the most. They're hit the most by monopolies. Oh, I forgot to get that in there. Oops, what happened here? They feared the monopolies that would come out of this. Monopolies raise prices. Monopolies actually can demand lower costs from, let's say, farmers. And then lastly, they saw it as, okay, Madison kind of wanted the idea of a rule of a few elite. Jefferson was not quite onto this, but as they saw it, this oligarchy, this rule by the elite, would become a plutocracy. A plutocracy is ruled by the rich, ruled by the wealthy. And when I mean wealthy, I mean money. So that was their fears. And so they were very upset. Madison was in the House, Jefferson's Secretary of State. Madison had great influence. It's going to the House and it's bitterly divided. But Hamilton knew how to buy those people off. Last thing for today. They came up with a compromise. By the way, this pretty funny picture in front of Independence Hall is Hamilton chasing Beelzebub, the devil of finance. Hamilton, Jefferson, the Vice President, Adams, and Madison left, or had a dinner. This would have been one of the most amazing dinners in history. And Hamilton knew exactly how to play Jefferson and Madison. They both wanted a rural capital, far from the new financial centers. So, where would it be? The District of Columbia. The District of Columbia in between Virginia and Maryland. Now, it's pretty much all in what we would consider would have been Maryland. Right at their home state. They would call this the District of Columbia, a territory named soon after Washington, D.C. They also knew that Washington was obsessed with the Potomac. Washington wanted this. Hamilton knew that would appeal to Washington, but also to the vanities of Jefferson and Madison, who are Virginians. And so literally out of a swamp along the Anacostia River, they built the capital of Washington, D.C., and the bill passed. And on that happy note, we are done. I know it went a little bit long. I had some technical issues. Hey, that's the price you pay. That's the price we all pay. I should probably go back and in post-production and cut this out, but I'm not going to. So please check Teams. Make sure you get your assignments. I'm going to give you another day for the reading assignment from whatever chapter it is, 7. Bill of Rights on Monday. I am collecting these notes. If there's any questions, please send it in on Teams, and do it tomorrow. I'll probably check. Friday, I'm not checking. I'm going to be busy. I'm doing some stuff for the teachers convention, that kind of thing. If there are no questions, I would like all of you to have a great day. I mean that relatively sincerely. No, I mean that sincerely. And goodbye.